10 o'clock. Let's start rolling. Hi everyone, I'm Dave Reuter with Franklin Soil and Water, and welcome to Stormwater Awareness Week. We're out here in one of our local streams picking up trash, making sure that we're taking care of our environment, and I encourage you to do the same. Stormwater Awareness Week is our regional outreach effort to cities, municipalities, and general public for the awareness of where our stormwater infrastructure is and how that affects our environment. One of the reasons we do trash pickups is some of the effects it has on the wildlife. You can see here that we've got some netting trapping fish in the creek itself, and they're still alive, and we let them go, but this trash effect is real problematic in urban areas. All this week is Stormwater Awareness Week, so do something, take some action to do something for water quality in our neighborhoods. Get rid of that. Move on to our next slide here, if I can get that going. Hopefully everybody's seeing that. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Central Ohio Stormwater Roundtable this quarter. Good to see everybody here, and good to see everybody participating in Stormwater Awareness Week by tuning in and getting some knowledge here via our outreach, I hope. Today we've got Matt Rapaski from City of Columbus talk to us a little bit about the new drainage manual that's out. If you aren't aware of that, we have a new City of Columbus drainage manual to follow. I know a lot of our municipalities follow that. We are going to be updating our county drainage manual to reflect some of those changes as well. So stay tuned to that. We have he's got some good information for us today. I do want to recognize our community partners. Again, you guys make it happen for us. Whoops, I got an automatic slide change in there, sorry. But yeah, our partners are important to us. That's why I will go back to them and show it again. Give them a little more time. And then we'll move on to some of the upcoming events that we have coming up here in town. OTEC, it starts next week. We do have XCal visual training opportunities. I left that in there from the last time as well, just because it's getting towards that end of the year for annual reporting purposes. If you've got education needs for your staff, feel free to contact us, and we can get you hooked up with some video training, remote training. It seems to be an easy way to go for folks to get people to get that training done. So do take notice of that if that's something you need, and give us a call. And I noticed the reminder on there, something that I always am looking for in the annual reporting is conducting your quarterly inspections of your MS4 facilities. If you haven't done that, it is something you need to be doing, and particularly, there may be even some monitoring needs that you need to do. So take note of that and get that done for the end of the year and for the annual report purposes. WAMO conference coming up November 4th, 3rd and 4th, and the OSWA webinar series, November 11th, is on utility scale solar site construction and stormwater management. We had a lot of inquiries about that. There's been some big solar facilities going in regionally and elsewhere. There's been some interest in understanding more about that, so tune in for that. That's all I have there. I'm going to stop my sharing here and let Matt take over. And again, we've got Matt Rapaski with DPU at City of Columbus talking about the changes and updates to the City of Columbus Drainage Manual. Matt, I will hopefully go ahead and let you have it. If you can share your screen.
Thanks, Dave. Is the first slide coming through okay? All right.
Yeah, if you didn't hear us.
I did not, but thank you.
I was on mute shaking my head. I wasn't sure if you saw it or not.
All right, great. Okay. So yes, as Dave said, I do want to kind of go over the 2021 Columbus Stormwater Drainage Manual that was made effective in May of this year. We did have sort of a phased rollout on that effectiveness for projects that were already kind of in the queue in the pipeline. We did have a 6-month sort of legacy clause on that, but that has come to an end just beginning of this week. So we're kind of in the new projects now fully expected to comply with the new manual. So a little bit more, if you weren't aware, the previous manual the city had issued was in 2012. And at some point in the past, the city had made a commitment that we would, every 5 years, we would evaluate the manual and provide updates or a new version. So you can see there was a bit more time between the 2012 and 2021. And I'll get into that and kind of explain a little bit of what happened. The only other caveat I would say is if you did attend a presentation that I did at the end of January this year, unfortunately, most of this presentation will look similar. I think the highlights that I went through then are going to be the same as in here, but the end part where we start to get into the new bond process that we're requiring in post-construction BMPs, that has been revised, kind of reflecting the final version. Okay, so as Dave said, my name is Matt Rapaski. I'm the MS4 coordinator for the City of Columbus. And in Columbus, the MS4 programs housed in our Department of Public Utilities Division of Sewerage and Drainage. And the things I just kind of want to go through the background and overview of the process leading up to the manual. Then I'll get into reviewing the different sections of the manual, picking out highlights that I think are significant enough changes would be of interest to others. And then, as I said, go through the new bond and CID, CID being our construction inspection deposit process. So the other thing that I'll just preface is that I do not have a good understanding. It's unfortunately not something I've been able to research, the number of municipalities or other entities in Central Ohio that kind of use by reference the city's manual. So certainly at the end, there'll be some contact information. If you have questions, you can certainly reach out to me and we can talk more about that if you have concerns about how our manual would interplay with any local regulations. So how do we get here? So we started the process in 2017. We're kind of right on time with that 5-year time frame. And we had gathered up internal comments that we had received from plan reviewers, from external stakeholders, and we started to do a review process. And then a funny thing kind of happened. I was almost about 4 years ago, and next week I was sitting at the WAMO conference. I was sitting next to Mike Galloway from Ohio EPA, and I received a text from my manager. I looked at it, and he's like, "Hey, you need to call me ASAP." US EPA called me. So I step out, talk to him, like everything's going to be all right. You know, we've got good records, not really too concerned about it. And so I went back in, sat down next to Mike. I was like, "Hey, Mike, funny thing." And he's like, "Yeah." And so I was just sort of like, well, you know, US EPA called. He's like, oh, yeah, sorry, I wasn't allowed to tell you about that. So that kind of changed the trajectory that we were on when it came to the Stormwater Drainage Manual revision. And one of the things when we did some of our outreach, we had received a question from a developer, and I won't name the individual. And one of those questions was, you know, that's all well and great that we do all of this work. You know, we have all these regulations, but hey, City of Columbus, how do we know we're making a difference? How do we know when we, you know, put all this cost into constructing stormwater control practices? How do we know, you know, that we're making improvement, that we need to do more, maybe we don't need to do more? And so the city heard that. And while we could explain how we had the current regulation in the 2012 manual, we really couldn't go back to the beginnings of the late 70s, early 80s, when the first kind of detention policy came into effect. We didn't feel we had full justification for why we had it. And so, you know, we hired a consultant and we looked at that. And the good news was, when we looked at about 5 or 6 other municipalities around the Midwest, including, I think it's Mecklenburg County in North Carolina, we found we were in the middle. And that's a good place to be when you're doing regulation. So the net effect there is that the city did not end up changing its detention policy in the 2021 revision. What we did do, though, is we did see that we are interested in something that we plan to do in the future, looking at the critical flow. And that's sort of a concept where rather than looking at sort of the rainfall events and the storms that come off, you're really looking at what is that capacity in the receiving stream to handle flow from your site, and then making your controls designed towards the stream itself rather than just kind of that engineering value. So I'll move through this. We had a lot of presentations. We presented certainly internally. We talked to MORPC. We had a Stormwater Drainage Manual Review Committee that was made up of many different partners, both internal, external, state level, public and private. You know, again, 2019, we were still, as we were developing things, and it really was a lot of hours. I kind of wish we had recorded how many hours, but it was a lot of time really to go through. There were some deep dives into things that honestly we hadn't changed since 2006, but really the city felt compelled, well, if we didn't have a good answer, we needed to get one this time around. Why were we doing what we're doing? Why was it in the manual? And so we finally, in July of last year, put it out for public comments. We had some other regulations that were kind of tangential to the Stormwater Drainage Manual that we also put out for comment at the end of last year, and then finally closed the public comment period on everything in January, and then eventually moved to make it effective in May. So, and this is that committee that I talked about. We had representatives from MORPC, development community, design community, Apprentice on the Water, and several environmental stakeholders, as well as the Ohio EPA. So we really tried to be comprehensive in who we talk to and take their inputs and do a substantial amount of, like I said, research to just answer the questions that we were asked. And so before I go any further, I think one of the big kind of changes, just because I noticed it's throughout this presentation, I use the term SCP, and that's stormwater control practice, specifically your post-construction stormwater control practices. And while the permit and probably most everybody, including myself, had always talked about BMPs, and often that was specifically the water quality BMPs, we changed terminology in our regulation and all of our regulations to focus on SCPs, which is a broader group of both the water quality ones required by outside regulation, and then the water quantity, which is kind of that elective City of Columbus regulation for detention and flood control. So in this presentation, I will generally not differentiate between the two. And when I say SCP, when it comes to enforcement, right now, we're not really differentiating between those. So if you've seen the manual, generally the overall structure, the 2012 manual, we didn't change the same 7 sections, and we did make some changes to the appendices. We trimmed out several of them and then replaced them and maybe added one new one, well, 2 new ones actually, D and E. And really one of the overarching goals or kind of concepts we had with the manuals, we were trying to make it less complex. We were trying to make it smaller and more usable. And the other big thing that we did, and I'll get into this later, is we tried to look at existing Ohio EPA regulation or standards and guidelines. And those guidelines kind of, through the construction general permit, become adopted standards if you really kind of push on it. We try to make reference to those rather than what we had kind of in 2006 and repeated in 12 was the city's manual was maybe ahead of the state's manual at that time when it comes to how to design practices. But since that time, the state had published their manual, the Rainwater Land Development Manual, and we felt more comfortable utilizing that. While it wasn't set as a state standard, we were trying to look at it as such wherever it made sense to do so. And then, of course, there are other regulations, but there's also other documents outside the Stormwater Drainage Manual. And these, if you go to our columbus.gov/stormwater website, are all available, but there are other documents that we've created that in order to kind of submit a plan, get a project through the city's process, you would need in addition to the design that's based on this regulation as well. And then lastly, there's the Inspection and Maintenance Guidance Manual. And that is something we talked about before. And that is where initially the city had, as part of our consent agreement, which became the blueprint program, there was a requirement that we had to have a maintenance manual for all of the city-owned practices. And in doing so, we went ahead and made that a little bit more generic and more usable so that if anybody wanted to use that manual in order to put together their stormwater pollution prevention plan, which is required under the construction general permit and also by city regulation now, they could do so. So the previous manual, we had kind of just one of the issues we tried to resolve was that we had applicability. We had an upfront section on applicability, but then we also scattered throughout the manual had several places where we said, this doesn't apply if this is your situation. And so really we had these kind of other cases throughout the manual. So we tried hard to scrub everything and pull it all forward and put it into a matrix or chart. And I kind of just, in the red circle there, just wanted to highlight something that we hadn't really previously focused on. Succinctly would be those activities that do not include installation of any impervious surface. And then also when it comes into play for single family dwellings and two family dwellings on a single parcel. And then generally the previous manual was not targeted at those at the high level concept. But when you really read through it, when it came to the stream corridor protection zone, the wetland protection, and floodplain compensation, those single family projects, the two family projects were not actually exempt. So we pulled that forward into the manual and kind of tried to make sure that that was upfront and clear to everybody. The other thing we looked at too was when we were reviewing plans, we always had looked at is what you're proposing a routine kind of maintenance project. And typically this applied to transportation projects. But it wasn't clearly defined in the manual. And so we came upon OEPA's routine maintenance exclusion, and we went ahead and adopted that formally into our language. And then when it comes to flood control, and this one may impact some of you in the surrounding communities if you're using our regulation, before our thresholds were 2,000 square feet of new impervious surface or 2,000 square feet of disturbance. And we've modified that to be 2,000 square feet disturbance of impervious area. So that's a fairly significant change that does kind of modifies what projects will trigger the manual. And then another change was on the definition of impervious surface and kind of influenced by conversations with Ohio EPA and a few projects that we had run into over time. We did add gravel parking lots and artificial turf surfaces, specifically in our definition of impervious surface. And then this was a request just from the development community for some clarity when we talk about redeveloping and looking at how long a site sits in its present condition, how far is that look back? Because that was always something that we, I guess, negotiated, I would say, through the plan development process. And what kind of the concept here is if there's an old building on a parcel and somebody comes in, purchases that, they demo that building, they remove all the rubble, and they put grass on the site. At what point in time, when you look at your pre and post conditions, do you consider that improved surface versus a grass surface? You know, we can look at it today, there's grass growing on it, but historically there wasn't. So that kind of cutoff point and that differentiation was nebulous. So we tried to put more of a 5-year definition on that. And then again, as I mentioned, roadway widening projects was a definition we needed to add, and specifically making clear that routine maintenance exclusion is something we incorporated as well. So moving to section 1, where we're looking at preservation and protection, there was a bit of change on the construction general permits, I should say, where they combined them 3 into 1. And the Rainwater Land Development Manual and then the Stormwater Drainage Manual all had different equations for kind of depending on which watershed you were in, and our equation differed slightly. So basically we kind of directed everything to what's in the construction general permit or the Rainwater Land Development Manual and kind of removed the previous equation that we had in there. And the other thing I was trying to highlight here would be that difference where you know, and this is straight out of the Rainwater Land Development Manual, where we have a traditional stream setback, which is kind of targeted at center line, follows the meander of the stream versus the streamway-based setback. So that's going to be a difference for some projects that will impact them. And then, you know, you kind of in that lower graphic, you have the bump outs, which in Columbus would also, if you have an adjacent wetland, we would then extend that stream corridor protection zone route to include that connected wetland as well. The other thing we did based on requests we'd received from the community was to develop some standard details for marking of the stream corridor protection zone in the field. We had always referred to, I think it was a sign or another aesthetically pleasing method, and that was just too unclear for people. So we went ahead and created some standard details, and this is an example of one of them, just to provide that guidance that was requested by the community. Section 2 is mostly about the hydraulics on the site, and so some of the more kind of engineering components. And so a couple of highlights there. We had a couple of projects where existing soil, surprisingly in Central Ohio, did allow for infiltration as a practice, and we didn't really actually have a provision to allow that. And so it was kind of this strange, do you need a variance? You know, the manual regulation doesn't allow you to do that, but you've got soil tests and engineering calculations to show that, yes, you will infiltrate everything into your natural soil. So we just made clear that you could do that. And then based on research, we used to allow up to 300 feet of sheet flow when doing your travel time designs. But at least in my experience, everybody sort of, you know, I remember learning as an engineer in school, you were supposed to go out in the field, you were supposed to walk the watershed, you were supposed to make observations about where your water's starting to convert and then do a measurement. And I don't believe that many people actually ever did that. So default, pretty much every design I've ever reviewed had 300 feet. But there is substantial research by USDA and others that showed it really needed to be lower than that. So we changed that 300 maximum to 100 feet maximum. And then just a minor comment, we used to have minor losses included in our pipe calculations. We eliminated that and just modified Manning's and that friction component to make up for all of those, just to try and make things a little easier on the designers and reviewers too. Another substantial change, and this was done by our public service departments, was the curb roadway conveyance, so the spread calculations, where that's really that safety component of how much ponding on a roadway is allowed before it becomes a hazardous condition. And that section has been heavily modified. They, in advance of the manual, due to demand again from the community, they released kind of an interim memo. The information in that memo is then formally adopted into the Stormwater Drainage Manual regulation to replace what had previously been in there. So section 3 is really where we get into the practices themselves and the hydrology of the site, you know, how to size them and select them. And so here, as I mentioned previously, we really lean and direct in many places to the Rainwater Land Development Manual for our design standards. And part of the education, when I've talked to folks over the years, one of the issues, when I look over some of the complaints that we received on the maintenance side of the post-construction practices, a lot of it has to do with the stagnant pools, the forebays and micro pools. And if you really look at the state's guidance on that, they're calling for a minimum of 3 feet depth, water depth on the forebay and 4 to 6 feet on the micro pool. And my observations, I don't see that often. And so I think that contributes a lot to the issue. The other concern that I have from a design perspective is that in our previous manual, as well as in the Rainwater Land Development Manual, there are charts indicating for each different kind of practice, whether it's a detention basin or bioretention or otherwise, what is the recommended or minimum drainage area we should have going to that practice. And I think the default for a lot of designers is to pick a detention basin, a dry detention basin that is on a pretty small site, probably because it's low cost, but does not have the watershed necessary to really make it function well. And so that ends up generating kind of a lot of nuisance complaints that we have to kind of muddle through from our program's perspective. The other change that we did do, we used to have rainwater harvesting specifically listed in our manual. We did go ahead and remove that. It is not, while there may be rainwater harvesting facilities in Columbus, there's none that were really done to satisfy our regulations per se. The regulation was always a little vague, not specific enough. We looked hard to try and find a really good one to adopt, and then coincidentally, Ohio EPA started developing one, so it was good for us to be able to direct back to them, again, the Rainwater Land Development Manual, and any of the provisional practices that they've issued as part of that. The underground storage, we used to have a pretty short section, maybe a paragraph. That was substantially modified and now occupies a couple of pages with some specific details based on the, learning kind of trial by fire. As we got a lot more of these designs in, we had to make some adjudications kind of on the fly. We incorporated all of our lessons learned and put that into the specification. And then blue roofs are something that we have seen enough that we felt we needed to put in some specific details on that. And so that's where, rather than having your detention basin down on the ground, you're putting it on top of the building. We borrowed heavily from New York City's specification on that one. And then another one, there used to be an exemption if you were if your project site was close to the Olentangy-Scioto River. It's an exemption on your detention requirements. And the thought here, again, is going back to hydrology, where if you think about those curves and kind of your peak flow, what this was trying to get at was to not stack those peaks, where by detaining water on a site downstream of that big flow coming down the river, when it released, it would actually contribute to the maximum flow. So that was the concept that we had, but I think in practice we found it was open to abuse, let's say, and so we went ahead and eliminated that specific exemption. And then we've always had a section on kind of high-risk areas, normally targeted kind of its commercial activity areas is what it's called in the manual. And again, based on some experience, we defined some high-risk areas that we may not traditionally think of commercial activity areas, which are more light industrial. But we do get a lot of issues with grease, particularly for, well, any facility that generates it, which tends to be a restaurant, a fast food restaurant, grease management and location of those grease and just the handling of that. And so what we do require specifically in those situations is we would put an oil water separator on the storm sewer system just to provide that extra protection at those facilities in case there is a failure to contain the grease or other trash properly. We used to have a constructed, and we still do have a constructed wetlands section in the manual, but when we really looked at it, it had some pieces in it that didn't quite meet the definition of green infrastructure. So we've added a whole new section called shallow constructed wetlands that is specifically geared towards if you want to have a green infrastructure practice that's a wetland, you can do so successfully and still also get some detention benefit from it. It's always kind of difficult to engineer, but we do have a constructed wetland and then a shallow constructed wetlands section in there now. We also have made reference, we used to have our own bioretention soil mix specifically in the manual. We removed that and now point to a standard specification that you could find on the city's blueprint page. There's several specifications we make available specifically for those blueprint projects. But that specification was reviewed in consultation with the state and other outside parties. So it's a pretty solid spec, and we just refer to it now rather than having kind of the state spec, the Stormwater Drainage Manual spec, and then a different spec for just blueprint. And then, of course, pretreatment was always something that's been required depending on what practice you have. That wasn't always clearly spelled out in the manual, so we tried to make that a specific section and call that out a little more clearly. And then we made some substantial changes to the appendix on the native plant species, and hopefully this was an improvement that will help a lot of people. What we were finding is that you know, and as an engineer, I probably would be guilty of this. I'm not a plant expert. So it seemed we were seeing a lot of designs that did not appear to have the requisite expertise kind of in the design itself. And there were plants that were being put in places where they didn't have, inside that practice, in a location where they didn't have a good chance. You know, either they didn't love being wet all the time and they were placed down low, or, you know, they weren't dry tolerant and they were placed higher up. So we tried to include this graphic and update the appendix itself. So for each plant, we kind of tell you what zone it should go in. And hopefully, even if somebody doesn't have a strong background in plants, they would still have a really good chance of putting together a successful design. Section 4, and then I'll touch on this now and get into a little bit more detail later on towards the end of the presentation. This was another substantial change. This was always kind of our maintenance section. And so some of the big things that we did through a lot of conversation with the development community is we now require on both the temporary, well, if you have a project that has a temporary sediment settling pond or a post-construction stormwater control practice, we're requiring a specific $10,000 construction bond for that. And that surety must be in the form of a bond and requiring it. The other thing there is, as I highlighted, we're also requiring an easement to the city and a maintenance agreement signed by both the owner and the city for that project. Now that easement is going to grant the city the right to enter the property and maintain it and charge the owner should the owner fail to maintain that practice as they're required to do so. So kind of here that SCP maintenance, again, so we have the maintenance agreement now, which is going to be a recorded document, and that just puts it in place that owner must inspect and maintain. One of the challenges that we found is that ownership of properties changes. The need that there's these engineered stormwater structures on the sites that just look like maybe vegetated sections of the parcel, you know, owners didn't know that they had that. And so as a recorded document, we're removing the ability for somebody to plead ignorance and hopefully getting it so that, you know, I purchased a home a few times. That stack of papers is pretty thick, but hopefully folks read it and realize that they're taking on this obligation and that they're aware of it, what's required and what to expect. So that when we show up to do our inspection, it's not the first time they're hearing about it. And like I said, that easement is to give the city, that easement will surround those post-construction practices, and then it also grants the city access to. And this is really a fallback, but it traces back to kind of one of those requirements in the construction general permits, as well as kind of going through our experience with USCPA. You know, we have an enforcement action, we can take you to courts, but at some point, you know, there's still this obligation on the city to make sure people are maintaining it. And we in Columbus decided that we need to have some backstop to give us the authority, should we need to do so, to go in and do that. So that was, of course, heavily discussed with the development community, but we did arrive on kind of what appears in the manual now.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
Do you want to take questions kind of as they roll in the chat box, or do you want to wait until towards the end? I've got one about the, asking about the easements a little bit more.
Let me go a little further and then I'll take a pause for questions.
Yep.
Right, so owner's inspection. So the other thing, and this one's kind of funny, I remember sitting at StormCon, I think it was in August of 2018, and there was a presentation on post-construction and listening to some other cities talk about their challenges. And I remember seeing the city's regulation appear up there, where Columbus was being called out for having a good regulation because we required folks to do an inspection and submit their forms to us every year. And I kind of laughed to myself because we were at that same time considering eliminating that regulation because we found it to not be very effective. And so what in Columbus we've done is, rather than have an enforcement program about paperwork, is we have hired the staff and put in place our own program where we will, within the term, within that permit term of our MS4 permits, go out and do those inspections, issue reports to the owners. Now that we still require the owners to perform those annual inspections, but they don't need to mail those into us. We're not going to check against that until we come out and do that inspection. So in that aspect, it's similar to those maintenance inspections folks need to do for their temporary controls. You need to have those records and need to be available for inspection when we show up. And then just real quick on section 6 and 7, those just get more into the actual, how do you put together your plan, and your design report, what do you need to include in there. So we updated that to be a little bit more modern on digital files. But we did have on the SCP quantities, that was another aspect that we also found from our inspection process. We would often have plans maybe that would have you know, post-construction BMP complete, and that would be a line item lump sum. And we had a lot of challenges in getting things constructed correctly. And kind of the size of the program is reviewing, you know, 400, at any one point, we had 400 active sites that we're inspecting just out of the, you know, just for their temporary erosion sediment control SWIPs. And so not every single one of those is going to have post-construction BMPs, but most of them will. So it's a lot of sites that we're managing out of the program, and we needed to have a way to kind of put it in front of the contractor as well as our inspectors to check against. And we're now requiring on plans for those quantities, specifically for the SCPs, to be detailed out on the plan itself. The other thing we're looking at is we do, you know, if there's an impervious area reduction on a plan, a lot of times that's included in the calculations. They can reduce their design. Sometimes they don't have to do any water quality controls because they reduced impervious areas. But we didn't internally have a good method for tracking that. So that's something that needs to be called out specifically on plans now too. And then getting into standalone SWIPs, which has been a requirement of the permit for a long time. But in Columbus, we had kind of broken that complete SWIP into multiple different pieces. And that was just a matter of how we internally administer the whole site development, plan development process. So we always had those pieces, but now we're requiring the designers to put those together into a single package that actually meets the definition, kind of what's spelled out in the construction general permit itself. So as I kind of went into that table, Appendix D is where we really go into the bid items and list that out. CMSC is just Columbus's material and specification manual. So making reference to that, and then just making clear, you know, what specific quantities we have for each of the SCPs that are on a site. And then Appendix C, probably for most folks here, again, just kind of providing a template for folks to utilize to put together both the SWIP that covers the construction portion of it, as well as the maintenance plan for the post-construction portion. All right, so I will pause there for questions, Brooke, if you have some.
Yep, I've got a couple here in the chat box. So the first one was asked, what will be the rule for the SCP easements if the storm structures are vaults within a building footprint? This occurs on many downtown or urban projects.
Correct. Yes. So that question, we've already internally answered that one. We crossed that path. So we will not require an easement for those, but we will require the recorded maintenance agreement.
Okay. And then the other question I have is, would you happen to know if the EPA requires the O&M agreement be recorded prior to construction start, or is that left for the local MS4 authority?
I would need to go back to the permit to be able to answer that question.
And I think Dave and I, we've had some conversations about that too in the past. Dave, do you remember what, if we did get an answer regarding that?
I don't recall
Okay.
at the moment, sorry.
That's okay.
I mean, what I recall is that the agreement was a suggestion in the permit, like it was an option that the local municipality, the MS4, could choose. But like I said, I'd want to double check that.
Sure.
Looks like John's chiming in on this. Maybe.
He actually, he has a question on, can you explain how blue roofs would have water quality treatment applied?
They would know they are pretty much a detention practice. The water quality would need to be addressed elsewhere.
Okay. Those are the few questions I had come in at that time. So
Okay, good.
keep taking them. If you guys have questions, keep putting them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end.
And we'll certainly have more of a roundtable at the end of Matt's presentation and kind of really open it up for everybody to ask questions. And I want to talk a little bit about post-construction as well at that time.
All right, so I've only got about 5 slides left. So on the bond and CID processes, and what, and so again, I don't know, I'll explain what we do in Columbus here. We require when you submit a plan that has stormwater components on it, the pipes, your other structures, your SCPs, we require you to put down a deposit, and then folks in our Division of Design and Construction actually come out and do inspection. And that's kind of a requirement. So you have this construction inspection deposits, and that pays for the city staff to go out and do those inspections. It doesn't cover any inspections done by my staff, but that's a totally different group. And then what we added in is the bond. And that was really to give us leverage if a project just stops working. And what I mean by that is what we really saw, right, 10, 12 years ago now, the Great Recession. There were a lot of projects that started and then they just were abandoned. And that kind of, that little treat has sort of been, we've been having fun with that for the last decade and just trying to clean those up because, when there's nobody around and there's no money to finish the work, we've made some of the improvements. It's just hard to do. So the bond is there. It is a low amount and we set it at 10,000 and we're going to see how that works. If we find that that's not sufficient, we had told the development community we could always come back to change that in a future revision to the regulation. But we're trusting that having a bond out there will keep everybody honest and give them that incentive to finish out a project. Because what we found is that if that CID deposit was not enough, there's only $500 left to remobilize and send somebody out to work on a basin, it didn't pay. And they would just walk away. And we were, then looking at it was a kind of a messy enforcement situation at that point. So the bond is there to try and prevent those. And then really, the process there's this whole package of materials, documents that get submitted up front to our building and zoning services department. We've got a loop there for the city review. We're kind of going through then, once you get through that, you're submitting those other documents, the standalone SWIP and the maintenance plan, and then we're approving that. And then from there, like I said, both the easements, if they exist, get recorded, but regardless, that maintenance agreement gets recorded. If an easement exists, that maintenance agreement is going to be an exhibit attached to it. So it's just one recording. But in the case of a plat, or as we said, if that detention facility is in a building, you know, the reason we aren't going to require easements on that is that there's a huge amount of liability and it becomes pretty complex legally to do so. But we'll still have the maintenance agreement recorded. And then that's an internal process there where our GIS unit kind of records that data in our internal digital repositories. And then we move into what folks had always done was put down the money for the inspection deposit that's now going to accurately reflect the cost of those SCP constructions. I'm not saying it didn't before, but you know, it's going to be a little bit more inclusive, I think, now. And then that surety bond as well. And then from there, we go into another process, which I'm not going to detail out today, but I do have a presentation next week where I will go through that one. And that's just kind of going through the city's internal mechanisms for how are we doing inspections, how is somebody, what do they need to do to get their bond released, to get their inspection deposit back, and really to lay out kind of all the internal workings of the city as different groups and different departments kind of interact on a project. And so that's a separate process. For those that have plats, then the plat gets recorded after the work is done, and then we just go into that maintenance. The owners required to maintain and inspect it. We're going to come out periodically and check the site. We'll issue reports. We may have requirements if something's deficient. We'll follow up with enforcement if necessary, but I'm just kind of showing that that's kind of that necessary route. And then to release that bond, and what you really need to do is you're going to, and so overall inherent in all of these bullet points is that the stormwater control practices, whether water quality or water quantity, need to be constructed per plan. So you're going to need to remove or convert those temporary basins if you had them and all of the temporary controls. You're going to need to have permanent stabilization on the site, and that needs to be satisfactory. You have to have good grass cover if that's what you're using. Then we're now, we always had a provision in there, but now we're requiring on all projects that an as-built survey needs to be performed of the stormwater control practices, and then the design engineer needs to certify that it was built according to plan. And so sometimes things deviate a little bit in the field, and so the engineer is going to take that responsibility to take on that responsibility to make sure it's within, it still meets the construction general permit requirements and other city regulations as applicable. And then, you know, kind of inherent in there is if that deviation is significant enough, then they'll have to go through a plan revision process and maybe submit new calculations to us to show that what was constructed, even though different, still meets all the requirements. And then depending on how things change, if necessary, they would need to revise their maintenance plan as well. So once those 4 items are received and somebody in the city has signed off, then we'll move that approval forward, and the bond and any bond would be released and any deposit would be returned. And then that's all detailed out in section 4 of the manual. So any other questions at this point?
I do not see any new ones in the chat box.
Okay. All right, so there's my contact information. If you have specific questions, you can send me an email. We also have a general email address if you have feedback specifically on the regulation itself. But either way, I will see it and try to get a response to you. So thank you all.
Thanks, Matt. So I was just going to say, make a comment. Our theme this year has kind of been on MCM5 and post-construction. And I was glad to see the as-built details included in there in the certification as well. That's something that I found problematic. We're helping a lot of communities right now with updating their post-construction programs, and the lack of detail has been the hardest part on a lot of these post-construction facilities. You know, when it comes to a lot of that has to do with elevation. I'm not out there with survey equipment or a crew to look at those elevations. It's a matter of, you know, eyeballing it and saying it's right, or maybe you have an as-built that has a top of casting elevation on it that you can measure off of, but having some of that detail is critically important with a lot of these facilities. So we'll be using that as well in our update of the manual. Do we have any questions out there? You know, I'll open it up to everyone now. If you have questions for Matt, feel free to chime in now. Now's your opportunity.
Oh yeah, there's a question there. Under House Bill 340, can the governmental authority enter my property and enlarge the waterway, then charge me for the improvement? In quotations.
Wow.
I'm not familiar with HB 340. The only thing I could say to that, and I don't know what that regulation entails, when we looked at this, there is an existing provision in state code that would allow us to do an assessment if we needed to make an improvement. We did not, you know, we have that is way down the road. I think there's a lot of other steps we would get to before we would, like I said, enter property to actually do an improvement.
I thought that was in regards to the ditch petition laws too. So that is the ditch petition process. You have to be a part of that process to be assessed those assessments on that ditch, on any of those maintenance items. So it's not like everybody along the ditch that's getting petitioned has to be in agreement to do that. And if you're not in agreement, you're not going to be assessed. So I would say no, they're not going to assess you anything that they do in the easement there relative to the petition ditch process.
Right, but it'd be very specific to the location, to where you are and what kind of ditch petition, what the specifics are, right? I mean, some counties have more ditch petition.
Well, and they're saying
others,
it's an enlargement of the area. If it's within, there should likely be an easement on that drainage easement. If it's within the drainage easement, I would say it's still just part of their maintenance or improvements.
Not maintenance, but enlargement. Yeah, we might have to get a few more details from you and maybe get you in touch with somebody else that can answer that question a little bit better. If you want to send me an email with your contact info, I can try to route you properly. So we're not.
The county drainage engineer is really the ones that run the petition ditch process. So they're
here in Franklin County.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Any other questions? Comments?
Feel free to unmute yourself if that's easier to do.
I'll give everybody about 5 more seconds and then I'll have to say, job well done. Any other items for the good of the order?
I guess just a reminder to folks that if you wanted certificates and you were in attendance here, I've been checking names off of the participant list. So look for a follow-up email in about a week with the recording link, certificate, and any other resources. And I'll try to include a copy of Matt's presentation as well in that, Matt, if that's okay with you, for folks to have. And I think that's my only pitch.
Great. And my only pitch is to say, remember, it's Stormwater Awareness Week. If you haven't done something, try to do something. Outreach to your communities. Take some action this week. With that, I think I will respect your time and say so long till next time. I appreciate you coming. Thanks again. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.